The candle had burned down by a third before Cecily Marsh found what she was looking for. She had not intended to find anything. The records room at Alderton Hall was not a place where things were found. It was a place where things were kept, and keeping was not the same as knowing. Rolled ledgers occupied shelves the length of one wall, their spines furred with the dust of 3 harvests. 2 wooden boxes held loose receipts bound with string. A single iron key hung beside the door on a hook that had not been touched by the evidence of the tarnish in longer than Cecily had been in service at the hall. She had been sent to dust. That was all. The Viscount's new steward, Mr. Hollins, had complained to the housekeeper that the records room smelled of damp and had not been properly ordered since the previous lord's time, and Mrs. Arden had sent Cecily because Cecily was reliable and quiet and did not take things that did not belong to her. She had been given a cloth, a candle, and the instruction not to disturb anything more than she needed to. She had not intended to read. The estate ledgers were the same size and binding as the ones her father had kept for the Hartstone parish accounts in the years before his cough took him, and her hand went to the spine of the nearest one before she had made any particular decision about the matter. She pulled it from the shelf. She opened it on the table beside her candle, because the afternoon light from the single high window was already failing. Her father had taught her to read a ledger the way a surgeon reads a body, not for what it shows, but for what it withholds. The credits column was tidy enough. The debits column was precise to the shilling. What was not tidy was the receipts column, the record of rents collected, named by farm and by tenant, with a note of the date each payment arrived. She had been in the records room for 20 minutes when she pulled the second volume from the shelf. She had been there 40 minutes when she began to compare them. There was a pattern in the gap between what was recorded as collected and what was recorded as received at the house accounts. She ran her finger down the pages, one column to another, her lips moving very slightly, as they had when she was 8 years old, and her father was teaching her that numbers do not lie, but people do. The same farms, the same tenants, the same dates. The sums did not reconcile. Not in the way that arithmetic fails to reconcile. Not error, not omission. But in the way that money fails to reconcile when someone has taken some of it and written down a different number where the real number used to be. She closed the ledger. She sat with her hands flat on the cover and looked at the candle flame until her breathing steadied. She had found it. She did not yet know what it would cost her. Cecily Marsh had come to Alderton Hall on the 3rd Tuesday of the previous October, carrying a small trunk with a broken clasp that she had tied shut with a length of brown cord. She arrived by carrier cart rather than by post, because the carrier charged 4p less, and 4p was a sum that mattered to her. The housekeeper who had written her recommendation had described her as a steady girl with an education above her station, which Mrs. Arden read as a polite warning and filed accordingly. She was 23 years old, and she looked it, slight and pale from a winter of thin meals, with dark hair she kept pinned without ornament, and hands that were already showing the early signs of scrubbing work in the redness at the knuckles. She was not the kind of woman the season would have noticed. She had long since stopped expecting to be noticed at all. Her father, Mr. George Marsh, had been a clerk to the incumbent of Hartstone Parish for 11 years before the consumption took him in the spring. He had left her a small box of books, a collection of copperplate letters, and the habit of precision. He had also left her £104 of debt, which she had paid over 17 months by taking every piece of work she could find. When she arrived at Alderton Hall, she was, in the careful arithmetic of her situation, £4 and her next quarter's wages from the edge of what she could manage. She had not come to Alderton Hall to find anything. She had come because she needed a position, and the position had been offered. The hall itself was a large Derbyshire stone house set on grounds that had once been well kept and were now merely tidy. Tidy being what a depleted household could manage when it could not manage more. Cecily learned the architecture of the place in the first week, as all servants learn it, beginning from the inside. The back stairs and the coal passage, and the scullery door, and the particular creak on the fourth step of the servants' stair, which she learned to avoid after midnight. The kitchen was warm, and Mrs. Arden ran it with a fairness that did not extend to warmth, but did not need to. Cecily was assigned to the upper floors and the main rooms, which suited her, because the main rooms held the library. She had been shown the library on her second day, for the purposes of learning which items were not to be moved and which surfaces required the soft cloth rather than the wool. She had noted the books the way a starving person notes a full table, and had proceeded with her inventory. She had not borrowed anything without asking. She had not asked. The Viscount, Lord Alderton, she had seen for the first time from the upper corridor window on her fourth day at the Hall, when he dismounted in the courtyard below after what appeared to have been a long ride. He was a tall man, 30-odd years, with dark hair that the wind had unsettled, and a way of moving that suggested someone accustomed to carrying more weight than was visible. He handed off his horse without looking at the groom, not out of rudeness, but out of the particular absence of a man whose mind had gone somewhere else entirely. He stood in the courtyard for a moment before going in, and what Cecily noticed, though she would not have said she was watching, was the stillness of it. Men who owned things did not usually stand still in their own courtyards. They swept through them. He stood there as if the stone beneath his feet had something to say to him. He went inside. Cecily returned to her work. The records room came 6 weeks later, in the deepest part of November, when the light failed by 3:30 and the estate contracted around its fireplaces. Mrs. Arden sent Cecily with the cloth and the candle and the instruction not to disturb what did not need disturbing. Cecily disturbed the dust only, and the spines of the ledgers, and, quietly, carefully, without making any sound at all, the orderly fiction of a man who had been stealing from a dead lord's estate for 3 years. It was on her third morning in the records room, working through the second box of loose receipts, that she heard the step in the passage. She did not startle. She had been trained out of startling by years of not having the luxury of showing that she was frightened. She lifted her head and looked at the doorway, and saw Lord Alderton standing in it, with his coat still on, and a pair of riding gloves in his left hand, watching her. He had not announced himself. She could not have said how long he had been there. His expression was not the expression of a man who had discovered a housemaid doing something she ought not to do. It was the expression of a man who had seen something and was deciding what to make of it. His eyes were on her hands, which had been moving in the column of the second ledger, with the specific directed motion of a woman who is checking figures, not transcribing them and not cleaning them. He had seen enough to know what she was doing. She waited. "What is your name?" he said. Not a question exactly, but not a command either. The words level and quiet. "Cecily, my lord." He looked at the ledger and then at her. "You are reading the accounts." "I was sent to put the room in order, my lord." "And the ordering of it required you to open the ledger." She considered the evasion and put it down. "The sums do not reconcile," she said. "I noticed when I was dusting the shelves. I should not have continued without leave. I was going to tell Mrs. Arden." He did not speak immediately. The riding gloves turned once in his hand, and were still. She could not read his face with any certainty, but she thought she could hear, in the pause, that he was not angry. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She laid the 2 ledgers side by side on the table and ran her finger down the columns the way her father had shown her, naming each discrepancy plainly, and giving him the arithmetic without commentary. He bent over the table and read. He was close enough that she could smell the cold air still on his coat. She moved slightly to give him room, and he did not take it. Or rather, he did not notice she had offered it, his attention all on the page. "How long have you been doing this?" he said, still reading. "3 mornings, my lord. I have worked through 2 of the 4 volumes. He straightened. His face had changed in some way she could not quite name, a tightening about the jaw that was not anger and not surprise, but something older. "Who taught you to read a ledger?" "My father was a parish clerk. He kept accounts for 11 years. He looked at her then, directly. For a long moment that she bore without looking away, because she had decided when she came to the hall that she would not make herself smaller than she was in any moment that asked her to be only herself. His eyes were the particular gray of winter light through cloud, and they were not cold exactly, but they were accustomed to withholding. "Continue," he said. "Don't touch anything. Don't speak of it." He was gone from the doorway before she had properly registered that he had given her the ledgers and left her alone with them, which was not what she had expected at all. She bent back to the page. Her hand was steady. Her heart was not, quite. But she had also been trained out of showing that. She brought her completed notes to Mrs. Arden that evening, on a single sheet of paper written out in her father's copperplate hand. She had done the arithmetic 3 times to be certain of it. The figure she set at the bottom of the page was £946 across 3 years, which was not a small number, and which had come from somewhere. Mrs. Arden read the page in silence. She was a careful woman and a loyal one, and her loyalty was to the household in the broad sense, which meant she did not dismiss what was in front of her, even when it was inconvenient. She folded the paper and said she would see that it reached the right hands. It reached Mrs. Dorothea Vane before it reached Lord Alderton. Mrs. Vane was the Dowager Viscountess, the widow of Edmund's late uncle by the senior branch, and she had been a presence at Alderton Hall since Edmund inherited, arriving with 3 trunks and the stated intention of helping the new Viscount find his footing. What she had actually brought was her niece, Miss Arabella Foss, who was 20 and accomplished and had a connection to the Derbyshire Fenwicks that Mrs. Vane considered sufficient grounds for a match. Miss Fossey was fair-haired and pleasant, and had been placed in Edmund's vicinity at every dinner since September, with the quiet inevitability of furniture. Mrs. Vane appeared in Edmund's study at 11 o'clock the following morning, before Cecily had been summoned, and before the household had properly understood what the paper contained. She was a handsome woman of 58, who wore her authority like good tailoring, fitted, assumed, and not expected to be questioned. She had read Mrs. Arden's summary of the situation. She had formed a view. "Edmund," she said, settling herself in the chair opposite his desk, as if the chair had been waiting for her. "You must understand what is happening here. The girl does not know her place. She has gone through papers that were not her concern and produced a set of numbers that contradict your own bailiff, a man who has served this estate for 7 years. She is either deluded or she is scheming, and in either case, the answer is the same." Edmund was standing at the window. He did not turn when she came in. "The answer is to show me the numbers, Aunt. The answer is to send the girl back to her work and speak to Crewe. Aldous Crewe has overseen 3 harvests and never given cause for question. Then the numbers will clear him. Edmund," her voice shifted into its instructional register, "a housemaid presenting herself in the Viscount's study to accuse the estate bailiff of fraud is a thing that will be talked of. It reflects on the house. It reflects on you. She has overreached herself, and the kindest thing you can do for everyone, including her, is to make that clear." He turned from the window. "Send her in," he said. Mrs. Vane looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of a woman whose good advice has been declined and who intends to remember this later. She rose. She departed. The door was left very slightly ajar, which Cecily, arriving from the back corridor 2 minutes later, understood to be deliberate. She entered the study and stood before the desk and told him what she had found in a plain account, beginning with the date and the ledgers and the method, and ending with the figure. She had the paper in her hand, the one she had given Mrs. Arden, returned to her by some path she had not traced. She offered it across the desk. He took it without hurry and read it, and then set it down and said, his voice at its most level, "Mr. Crewe will be asked to explain the discrepancies." She understood that this was not a dismissal and that it was not an endorsement either. It was a statement of the next procedural step from a man who would not commit himself beyond what the evidence currently supported. "Yes, my lord," she said. "You will not speak of this. Not to the other servants. Not to anyone in the household." "No, my lord." He looked at her for a moment with that weighing expression she was beginning to recognize. "Miss Marsh." He had never used her name before. Where were these discrepancies? She named them for him. The Bramley Farm receipts and the Colton Farm receipts and the 3 tenancies on the southeast corner of the estate. 17 separate entries across the 3 ledger years, each one off by an amount small enough to escape casual notice, large enough to accumulate. He nodded once. He said nothing further. She understood herself to be dismissed and took her leave, and as she crossed the entrance hall below, she heard from the drawing room the murmur of Mrs. Vane's voice addressing Miss Fossey in the measured tones of a woman who is composing herself after a minor setback. The hall prepared for a small dinner party that week, one of the last of the autumn before the roads became uncertain, and the neighborhood retreated to its own firesides. Cecily's duties required her in the dining room and the hall, which meant she passed through the principal rooms more than usual. And on one of those crossings, she passed the study door and heard, without intending to, the voice of Mr. Crewe inside. He sounded easy. He had brought his own ledger. She heard him explain, in the confident tones of a man who is prepared, that the Bramley Farm rents had been received late and in installments, which accounted for the apparent discrepancy in the collection dates, and that the Colton tenancy had reduced its payment by agreement due to the failure of the barley crop. He had documentation. He was, by the sound of it, well prepared. She had stopped walking. She stood in the hall with a pair of candlesticks in each hand and listened, and what she felt was not panic, but the particular cold alertness of someone who recognizes that the ground has shifted and must decide how to stand on it. She delivered the candlesticks. She returned to her work. 3 days later, crossing the passage that ran between the kitchen wing and the main hall with a covered tray, she passed the open door of the steward's room and heard voices within. She recognized the lower one as Crewe's. The other, dry and precise, belonged to Mr. Prentice, who was the estate solicitor from the town, and who came to the hall once a quarter to review the accounts with whichever lord or steward would receive him. Ridley, she would later learn, had been in the passage for 10 minutes before she arrived, having been sent to leave an invoice on the steward's desk, and found the door already ajar. "The matter has been explained to his lordship satisfactorily," Crewe was saying. "A housemaid brought a complaint based on a misreading of the collection dates, the kind of error you'd expect from someone who does not belong near the accounts in the first place." "And his lordship was satisfied?" Prentice said. "He will be. The girl does not know her place. She was sent to clean a room, not to practice as an estate agent." There was a sound of papers moved. "The difficulty is in the correction. A new lord, still uncertain of his ground, may let it run on longer than is wise." Cecily walked on. She did not stop. She held the tray level and kept her pace even, and carried the thing the 12 remaining yards to the kitchen door, where she set it down and stood for a moment with her hands on the edge of the table, and breathed. That evening she went back to the records room after the household had gone to bed, with the candle stub she had saved from the morning, and she opened the third ledger and read until the candle gave out. There was a second layer. She had found the first pattern in the collection dates and the received sums. The second pattern was in the estate's own payment records, the disbursements, the expenses logged against the estate account. There were payments to a firm of glaziers that the hall's windows did not reflect, payments to a draining contractor for fields that, by the evidence of the records from 5 years prior, were already drained. Small amounts, irregular intervals, always inside the margin of plausible estate maintenance. Crewe had not been stealing one way. He had been stealing two. She wrote it down. She was very cold, and the candle had burned to nothing. And she sat in the dark for a moment before she felt her way to the door. What she needed now was not more figures. What she needed was a witness who knew which rents had actually been paid, by hand, in person, before Crewe recorded them. What she needed was someone who had been present when the money changed hands. The following morning, at the water pump in the stable yard, she spoke to Mr. Thomas Ridley. Ridley had been head groom at Alderton Hall for 41 years, which meant he had been present for the previous lord, the lord before that, and the long, difficult interval between the two, and his memory for anything connected to horses was absolute. He was also, as it happened, the man who had driven the collection cart on the days when Mr. Crewe had ridden out to gather the quarterly rents, because Crewe had complained of his knee and needed the cart, and Ridley had been present at several of those collections as a matter of practical necessity. He listened to Cecily's question without expression. He pumped water. He handed her the bucket. "Bramley Farm," he said, filling his own. "August quarter. Old Bramley paid £7, 3 shillings, and I saw him count it out on his own kitchen table. Every coin." "What does the ledger say?" she said. "I couldn't say what the ledger says," he said, "but I know what I saw." She asked about the Colton tenancy. He told her. She asked about the 2 farms on the southeast corner, and he told her those as well, not quickly, but accurately, in the specific remembered way of a man who was present for the thing and has not been asked about it until now. He had not thought to report anything, because no one had asked him to look, and the ledger was not his responsibility, and Crewe had always been confident and connected, and no one had thought to look. She thanked him and carried her bucket back to the house and set it on the scullery floor, and stood for a moment with her hands on the edge of the stone sink. She needed to tell Lord Alderton. She was aware that Mrs. Arden would say it was not her business, and Mrs. Vane would say she had no place. She was aware that Mr. Crewe was already on record as having provided a satisfactory explanation, and that a housemaid contradicting a satisfactory explanation was at considerable risk of seeming, at best, persistent to a fault, and at worst, a troublemaker with motives that more comfortable people would find it very easy to imagine. She thought of her father's copperplate hand, correcting her sums at the kitchen table in the lamplight. He had taught her that the number was the number, and if you had done the arithmetic correctly, and the arithmetic said one thing, and the ledger said another, the ledger was wrong. He had also taught her that being right was not the same as being believed, and being believed was not something you could afford to count on. She dried her hands. She went to find Mrs. Arden. If the heart of the matter could be said to have turned anywhere, it turned in the Viscount's study at 10:30 on a Friday morning, 6 days after Cecily had spoken to Ridley. Edmund had summoned her. She came without Mrs. Arden, which meant he had requested her specifically, and she felt that specificity in the cold corridor with a directness she had not expected. She knocked. She entered. He was at his desk. He looked as he always looked, contained, precise, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. On the desk in front of him were 2 of the estate ledgers, both open, and beside them a small leather-bound volume she did not immediately recognize. It was older than the estate ledgers, darker from handling, and it bore on its front cover the initials CAV stamped in gold that had faded to the color of dried grass. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I have been through the 3rd volume," he said. "The disbursement entries. There is a glazier contracted to work at Alderton Hall in the spring of 1812. I have found no evidence of work completed. There are 4 additional entries of similar character." He paused. "You noticed these?" "Yes, my lord." "Before or after you spoke to Ridley?" "I found the disbursement pattern first. I spoke to Ridley to confirm the collection accounts." He was quiet for a moment. His hand rested on the small leather volume. She looked at it, and something in her expression must have shown, because he followed her gaze. "This was my brother's," he said, and his voice was the same level tone. But there was something underneath it that she could hear the way you hear ice under snow, by the way the surface doesn't yield quite correctly. Charles kept his own accounts, independent of the estate. He had always been uneasy about the rents. I did not know this until after he died. He did not say how Charles had died. She had not asked, and she did not ask now. She had learned enough of the household to know that Charles Vane, the previous Viscount, had died 18 months prior in circumstances the household preferred not to discuss, and that Edmund had been on the continent, and that he had come home to a title he had not wanted, and an estate hemorrhaging money that he had not yet been able to account for. "My father kept a volume like that," she said, before she had decided to say it. "The same size, the same printer's mark, I think, at the bottom of the spine. He used it for the parish accounts. He said a man who kept his own parallel record had a defense against dishonesty, that a man who relied only on others' records did not." Edmund looked at her. The weighing expression was there again, but there was something else in it now, something she could not entirely read. His hand moved on the cover of Charles's book, and was still. "Ridley's testimony is not sufficient on its own," he said. "His recollection of specific amounts from the August quarter is valuable, but Crewe will argue memory error, and a sympathetic magistrate might accept it. I need the disbursement entries verified against the tradesman's own records. The glazier would have his own account of work not done," she said. "Yes." They looked at each other across the desk for a moment. If you have stayed with this story this far, you may have begun to understand what she had understood from the first morning she sat in the records room with her finger on the diverging columns, that the truth of a thing and the power to speak it aloud are not the same thing, and sometimes the distance between them is a very long way across. Leave a quiet thought in the comments if something here has moved you, and then come back, because there is still a reckoning to come. "I will write to the glazier," Edmund said, "and to the draining contractor. The replies will take no more than a week." He looked down at the ledgers. "You will say nothing of this?" "No, my lord." He nodded. He was reaching for his pen when she rose to go, and she was at the door when he said, behind her, without looking up, "Miss Marsh, your father's parallel record. Did it serve him in the end?" She paused with her hand on the doorframe. "It served the parish," she said. "That was what he wanted it to do." She left him with that. The letters came back from the glazier and the draining contractor within the week, both stating that they had done no work at Alderton Hall in the years named, that they had received no commission from the estate, and that they had no record of any such engagement. Edmund had them witnessed and set aside. He sent for the solicitor, a Mr. Prentice, to come from the town on the following Tuesday, and the household understood without being told that something was happening, and drew its collective breath. It was on the Monday evening that Mrs. Vane made her third and most considered attempt to correct the situation. She had arranged a small dinner 6 persons at the table: herself, Miss Foss, Edmund, a neighboring magistrate named Sir Gerald Croft, who was spending the week, and 2 other guests from a local property. It was, to the observing eye, a pleasant dinner. Miss Foss wore ivory and was placed beside Edmund and spoke to him about music, which she played very well. Sir Gerald ate heartily and spoke about the roads. Mrs. Vane orchestrated everything from her end of the table with the smooth authority of a woman who has given dinners for 30 years. Cecily was in the dining room twice during the first course and once during the second. On the second occasion, crossing from the sideboard to the door, she passed within a few feet of where Mrs. Vane sat and heard her say to Miss Foss in a tone designed to carry just past the candles, "The girl who doesn't know her place has written rather a great deal of nonsense, I understand, and Edmund has been too patient in hearing it. A new viscount can afford to be lenient with the servants for a season, but there are limits, and one hopes he will recall them before the winter is out." Miss Fossey looked down at her plate. She did not reply. Cecily carried the dish to the door and set it on the tray outside and stood in the corridor for a moment in the cold with her hands closed at her sides. She was not afraid. She had been afraid before, specifically and concretely, when she had £4 and no position and the debt to her father's name pressing against the winter, and she knew what fear felt like in the body. What she felt now was something quieter, the knowledge that the ground was about to move, and that she had done what she could do, and that the rest was no longer in her hands. The morning brought Mr. Prentice, the solicitor, in a brown coat and a nervous manner, who was shown to Edmund's study and remained there for 2 hours. It also brought, at 11 o'clock, a knock at the door of Cecily's room in the servants' corridor. It was not Edmund. It was one of the footmen, young James, who told her with evident discomfort that Mr. Crewe had reported to Mrs. Arden that a silver porringer from the main dining room had been found to be missing, and that Crewe had reason to believe it had been seen in Cecily's possession. Mrs. Arden was required to search the room. James was sorry. He genuinely looked it. The porringer was in the box under Cecily's bed. It had not been there the night before. She knew this with the certainty of a woman who occupied a small room and knew the exact position of every object in it, and the knowledge landed not as a shock, but as the specific cold clarity of understanding a strategy in the moment it completes itself. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the porringer in Mrs. Arden's hands and said, "I did not put that there." Mrs. Arden believed her. Mrs. Arden was a careful woman who had known Cecily for 6 months and knew what she was. Mrs. Arden was also a woman whose authority extended only so far as the household permitted. And above the household sat Mrs. Vane, who had heard the report from Mr. Crewe and had already drawn her conclusions. Cecily was confined to the servants' hall, pending investigation. She was not dismissed. Not yet. But the word had reached the upper floors, and the particular quality of quiet that fell over the house had in it the shape of a verdict already half-rendered. She sat in the servants' hall with her hands folded on the table and looked at the wood grain and thought about the third ledger and the glazier's letter and the draining contractor's letter and the cart ledger that Ridley had mentioned in passing, the one he kept himself because he liked to know which farms he had visited and in what season. She had not thought of the cart ledger as evidence. She was thinking of it now. In the drawing room above her, Mrs. Vane was speaking to Edmund. She was, by the account Cecily received later, very calm. She had come a long way from the instruction to send Cecily back to her work. She had arrived, by her own private logic, at the position that the girl had overreached herself, had been found with stolen property, and that the reasonable and merciful outcome was a quiet dismissal with a reference that mentioned only the practical qualities and left the rest unwritten. She spoke of this with the particular generosity of a woman who believes she is being kind to someone who has ceased to deserve it. Edmund listened. Sir Gerald, who had stayed the night and was present in the room, also listened from his chair by the window, with the expression of a man who has not yet been called upon to have an opinion and is reserving his position. Miss Fosse, seated at the pianoforte but not playing, kept her eyes on the music on the stand. Edmund said nothing for a long moment after Mrs. Vane finished. Then he crossed to the door and said to the footman in the hall to please ask Mr. Ridley to come to the drawing-room, and to ask Mr. Crewe to be available in the hall, and to send word that Mr. Prentice should come up from the study. "Mrs." Vane said, her voice sharpening very slightly. "Edmund, this is not necessary." "No," he said, "it isn't." He moved to the fireplace and stood with his back to the room, looking at the fire, in the specific attitude of a man who has decided something and is waiting for the space to act. Ridley came in still in his work coat, having been found in the stable. He held his hat in both hands and stood near the door, and looked at no one in particular, with the equanimity of a man who has been on this estate longer than anyone else in the room, and is not easily unsettled by the arrangements of the gentry. Mr. Prentice came in behind him, carrying a leather satchel. Then came Mr. Crewe from the hall, where he had been waiting with the particular controlled confidence of a man who had prepared for this and expected to manage it. Edmund turned from the fire. He produced the glazier's letter first, then the draining contractor's letter. He set them on the small table beside him, with the deliberate unhurry of a man who has all the time he needs, because the facts are not going anywhere. He opened the ledger to the disbursement pages and set it beside the letters. He produced the glazier's invoice from a previous legitimate engagement, dated 6 years prior, for comparison of the handwriting, which did not match the entry in the estate ledger. Crewe's confidence did not break at once. It shifted. Cecily, who had not been told to come and had come anyway, standing in the doorway where she had not quite entered the room, watched his face go from prepared ease to the specific calculation of a man running through his options in real time. "These discrepancies," Crewe said, "can be explained by the contractor's own poor record-keeping. It is not uncommon for a tradesman to misplace invoices." "Ridley," Edmund said. Ridley did not need to be prompted. He had, at some point between the stable and the drawing-room, retrieved from his coat pocket a small, worn notebook with a green cover, which he held open in one hand. He read from it without particular drama: the August quarter at Bramley Farm, £7 3s, received by hand. The November quarter at Colton Tenancy, £5 10s, received by hand. The May quarter at the South East Corner Holdings. 4 amounts, ranging from £2 to £4 8s, all received by hand in his own presence, all named by tenant. He closed the notebook. He said, "I've kept that record since before Mr. Crewe was in the position." The room was very still. "She found what no one else in this house looked for," Edmund said. He was not looking at Crewe when he said it. He was looking at Cecily, in the doorway, with the gray slate eyes that she had learned to read, at least a little, over the weeks of proximity and silence. It was not a triumphant look. It was something quieter than that, and it was addressed to her alone. Mrs. Vane made a sound. She had been sitting with her fan held at exactly the height that indicated she was managing a situation, and the fan had stilled. Sir Gerald, from his chair by the window, said in the conversational tone of a man announcing a matter of procedure, "I believe I should look at those letters, if there is no objection." He rose. He was, after all, a magistrate, and had been one for 12 years, and had seen this particular kind of arithmetic before. What followed was procedural and deliberate, and took most of the morning. Prentice confirmed that the discrepancies across the 4 ledger years amounted to £1,217, once the disbursement fraud was included alongside the rent shortfall. Crewe disputed several figures and then disputed fewer. Sir Gerald asked 3 questions and said he would need to speak to the tenants directly, which he did that afternoon, riding out with Edmund and coming back 2 hours later with corroboration from 5 separate farms. Crewe had, by the end of the morning, retreated from explanation into silence, and Sir Gerald had made the necessary arrangements. The porringer was found at Crewe's cottage the following day, in a box in the pantry that he had apparently not expected to be searched. Edmund cleared Cecily formally in the presence of Mrs. Arden, with the whole of the servants' hall as inadvertent witness, stating plainly that the accusation against her had been fabricated, and that she had done nothing that did not reflect credit on her. Mrs. Arden said, "Yes, my lord," in a tone that indicated she had known this all along, and was glad to have it on record. Mrs. Vane departed for Bath at the end of that week. She had said very little since the drawing-room, conducting herself with the particular dignity of a woman who has been wrong in a public way and has chosen to absorb it quietly rather than compound it with further argument. She was not, in the end, a cruel woman. She was a woman whose world had a specific shape, and she had believed in that shape completely, and it had not held. She did not say goodbye to Cecily. She said goodbye to Edmund with great formality, and was handed into the carriage, and was gone. Miss Arabella Fosse, on the morning before her aunt's departure, came to the servants' hall. She stood in the doorway with her gloves in her hand, and looked at Cecily across the room with the expression of a woman who has had several days to think something through. "I am sorry," she said, "for what was said, and for not speaking when I should have." Cecily looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, Miss Fosse," she said. Miss Fosse nodded. She withdrew. She had a quiet and pleasant nature, Cecily thought, and had been placed in a situation by her aunt that had not been of her choosing, and had conducted herself in it with reasonable decency once the situation resolved itself clearly enough to move. The house settled into December with the particular quality of a place that has passed through something and returned to itself, quieter than before, but more itself for the quiet. The last of the autumn's social obligations fell away. The neighborhood roads grew uncertain, as Mrs. Vane had predicted, and the hall drew in around its fireplaces. On the first Thursday of December, Edmund sent word that he wished to see Cecily in the study. She had been in and out of the study in the weeks since Crewe's removal, primarily in the company of Mr. Hollins, and then a new agent Edmund was considering, who had been brought up from the county town to review the estate accounts with the assistance of what Cecily had documented. She had been asked questions and had answered them, and had provided the relevant pages, and had been thanked, precisely, and without excess, in the way of a man who means what he says, and does not say more than he means. She had not been alone with Edmund in the study since the morning of the cart ledger. She came in at 5:30, when the light had long since failed, and the fire was high against the December dark. He was not at his desk. He was standing beside the mantelpiece, where the fire was brightest, with his coat on and his hands at his sides. On the mantelpiece beside him, she saw the small leather book with the faded gold initials. Charles's account book. He had taken it from his pocket and set it there. She stood before the fire and looked at the book, and then at him. "My brother kept that book," he said, "because he knew something was wrong and did not know what. He died before he could find it." He paused. The fire moved. "He left me a title and an estate and a debt I did not understand, and a record book that I have been carrying for a year and a half as though it were a question I had no way to answer." Cecily said nothing. She waited for the thing he was working toward. "You answered it," he said. "Not as a service to the house?" as a thing that was true and needed to be seen. He looked at the book. I have been considering, since the matter was concluded, what that is worth. I have found that I cannot value it in the categories I have available. She looked at his profile in the firelight. The jaw like carved stone. The eyes that had been weighing her since the first morning in the records room. She had become, she thought, rather better at reading him than she had been in October. "Cecily," he said, and used her name with the deliberate weight of a man who has chosen this moment for exactly this purpose. "I am not asking you a question of household management. I am asking whether you would consent to remain at Alderton Hall in a permanent capacity, not in service. As my wife." The fire settled in the grate with a small sound, and snow was falling outside the window that she could see from where she stood, fine and steady in the dark beyond the glass. She did not feel triumph. She felt the specific warmth of something she had stopped expecting, arriving not as a restoration of what had been, but as a thing she had not known to want until she was standing in front of it. "Yes," she said. Not because it was the prudent answer, and not because it was the safe one, but because it was true. And she had been trained from childhood to put the true number in the column, and let it stand. He crossed to her. He did not take her hand at once. He stood close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him and the particular quality of his stillness, which she had been reading since the first morning, and said very quietly, "I should have spoken sooner. I am sorry for the time it cost you." "You required evidence," she said. "You were right to." Something moved across his face that she thought might, in a man less accustomed to withholding, have been something like relief. His hand came up and held hers, gently, and with the particular firmness of a man who does not do things halfway once he has decided to do them at all. She looked at Charles's account book on the mantelpiece beside the fire, where it had been put down and would stay. The faded gold initials caught the light. Her father had had a book just like it, and he had taught her with it, and it had done the work it was made to do. The snow fell outside the window of Alderton Hall, and the fire burned quietly. And she stood in the warmth she had not known to name as hers until this moment, and held it. If this story found you this evening, thank you for staying all the way through. Leave a thought in the comments if Cecily's particular kind of courage moved you in any way, and until next time, take care of yourselves.